Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to have you with us for another session of the Foundation for International Freedom, Fundación Internacional para la Libertad, who's holding this meeting jointly with Fundación Libertad. We have an extraordinary guest today. It's really a great honor to have Francis Fukuyama, Dr. Francis Fukuyama with us. He's an old friend of this institution and of many of the participants in this institution, and someone that we have followed for a very long time with admiration and for gratitude, and with gratitude for all the things he has taught us and shared with us. He is currently, of course, at Stanford University. It's very early in the morning down there, but he's an early riser, so we're delighted to have him from California. Let me quickly mention some of his impressive titles. He has many, so I won't be able to mention all of them, but he's currently the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at the same institution. And he's also the Director of Stanford's Master's International Policy program. He's, of course, very famous for writing articles and essays and books that have kicked off important debates around the world. I will only mention a few of them. Of course, The End of History and The Last Man, that followed his very famous essay on the end of history, one of the most misunderstood pieces of work in the history of the 20th century. He's also the author of The Great Disruption, of The Origins of Political Order, and most recently of Identity, the Demand for Dignity, and the Politics of Resentment. So he's really one of the great public intellectuals of our time, and it's a great honor to have him with us today. We will be following exactly the same format that we usually follow. After this brief introduction, he will speak for about 10 minutes, and that will be followed by a conversation, a dialogue, in which I will allow as many as possible of you to participate if you're willing to share some of your questions with me through the chat window. The topic today, of course, is the political impact of COVID-19. Global populism, a topic on which Dr. Fukuyama has been writing and speaking for quite a while, and of course, US politics and the US elections. So Frank, if I may, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you with us, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alvaro. It's a great pleasure to address the Fundación Libertad. I want to say before I begin one little advertisement. I have just founded a new online magazine called American Purpose. Actually, Alvaro, your father was on the board of the predecessor of this, the American Interest, which has ceased publication, but we are dedicated to something that your foundation, I think, is interested in, which is classical liberalism. We feel that classical liberalism is now under attack from both the right and the left. And we need, to have voices that stand up to defend it both normatively and as a matter of practical politics. So you can find this at AmericanPurpose.com if you go on the internet. So let me say a little bit, the COVID epidemic has been a little bit like a natural experiment for political and social responses to a global pandemic. And there's been a lot of discussion about what kinds of characteristics have been most important in dealing with the pandemic. One early discussion had to do with democracy, because there was an argument made that authoritarian regimes were doing better in dealing with the pandemic than democratic ones. I don't think that this really stands up under a broader analysis, because you'll find many democracies around the world that have actually done quite well. So if you look at Taiwan or South Korea or Japan in Asia, or if you look at Germany or many states in Scandinavia, they've actually, or Canada, let's say New Zealand, you'll find many democracies that actually have a better record than an authoritarian country like China. I think, however, that the problem right now is that when people think about democracy versus authoritarian government, they're actually thinking of a two-way comparison between the United States and China. And there, the comparison looks very, very bad because, as you're quite aware, the United States, we've just passed something like 210,000 COVID deaths. We don't have the highest per capita death rate, but we're, very much at the top of the international tables. We had something like 4% of the global population and a quarter of the COVID deaths, and we don't seem to be anywhere near the end of this. And the epidemic, as you've probably been following, has been spreading into the White House this past week. There's this remarkable statistic that there are now more COVID infections in the White House staff than in the entire nation of Taiwan over the past week. And so, it obviously is something that has gravely weakened the international image of the United States. And I think that it will have geopolitical consequences because I think it follows on what I have described elsewhere as a long-term decline and decay of American institutions. And in a sense, the COVID epidemic has simply accelerated that. But let's step back from this question for a moment and talk about what has really increased resilience to the epidemic. And I think there are several different factors. One of the obvious ones is state capacity. If you have a public health sector that is well staffed, has a lot of professional people, is run competently, and has adequate resources, then obviously you're going to be in a position to deal with this disease. And I think that one of the reasons that many countries in East Asia have done relatively well in the epidemic is that they have pretty competent state sectors. This is one thing that distinguishes East Asia from, many other parts of the developing world, that they have a long state tradition. They've got competent bureaucrats and technocrats. And in a country like South Korea, for example, the head of their Centers for Disease Control was really put in charge of their response. She became the most trusted official in the country, and that's one of the reasons they've been able to master the early outbreak of the disease. I think the second factor that's really important has to do with trust. This has to do with trust in government, but also trust of citizens for one another. And, in a lot of countries in Northern Europe especially, you have a high degree of social consensus that has been a big asset to the government. So Angela Merkel, for example, has actually seen her popularity increase, and the popularity of the right-wing Alternative for Germany, the AfD party, has fallen in the course of the epidemic because people think that she's competent and therefore have given legitimacy to her government. On the other hand, I think your country, or Spain at least, is an example where there's a lot of division and distrust. And in my country, in the United States, it's really reached epidemic proportions because we're characterized by a really high degree of polarization. It's weakened the response. It's to the point where a simple act like wearing a mask has become a political statement. So if you like President Trump, you refuse to wear a mask, and if you don't like President Trump, you do wear a mask. And so people are not making this decision based on any kind of rational assessment of public health requirements. They're doing this basically on the basis of which political side they line up with, and it's completely crippled our ability to deal with the disease. Then finally, I think there's a kind of final factor that really does have to do with leadership. Um, I think that in particular, it's interesting that populist leaders seem to do particularly poorly in responding to the crisis, and I would point to three of them. So one is my president, but if you look in Latin America, you have one populist on the left who's Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO in Mexico, and a populist on the right, Jair Bolsonaro. And all three of them have been very similar in their responses. They minimize the importance of the disease. They refuse to take early measures to impose quarantines or shutdowns. And as a result, all three countries have really terrible uh, results. I think if we look down the road, what's going to happen geopolitically, I think there's a number of important shifts that are going to occur as a result of the pandemic. One, I think, is a continuing uh, shift towards East Asia in terms of the center of the global economy, because it's not just China. We're talking about Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, many other countries in that region. Because they've been relatively effective in controlling the disease, they're also able to get their economies working and back to pre-pandemic levels. So China in the third quarter looks like it's returned to levels that it would have expected had there been no pandemic at all. And that means that the center of the global economy is going to continue to shift to that region. I think in the developing world, you have a very different story. It was interesting because in the early phases, there were many developing countries that seemed to be doing okay. There were not high levels of infections in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, and other countries in the subcontinent. In Latin America, for example, a number of countries like Colombia and Peru, Bolivia, they imposed lockdowns very early on and did not seem to be suffering from very high levels of fatalities the way that Italy or Spain or the United States were suffering. But that's all been changing very rapidly beginning in the summer. And here I think you see the effects of a combination of factors. So one of them is the weak state capacity, that it turns out it's relatively easy to impose a quarantine from the top down, but it's much harder to keep the quarantine going over a period of months. And then economic pressures start to kick in because people need to go back to work. One of the really important crippling facts about many developing countries is the high percentage of their labor force that's in the informal economy. And so in Peru or Brazil or Colombia, you have upwards of 50% of the labor force that is informal. They don't have access to formal benefits, to pensions, but most importantly in this case to health care. And so they have to go back to work in order to feed their families. They don't really have adequate medical attention. And I think that's why you're seeing this, very troubling rise in infections in many developing countries. We don't really know the extent of this because one of the correlates of weak state capacity is the weak ability to actually keep statistics and monitor developments effectively. But I think when we find out, what's been going on, we'll see that there's been a slow rolling crisis that is really reaching terrible proportions in many of these countries. And that, is a terrible tragedy because I think it's really meant that the whole past 10 or 15 years of pretty good economic growth throughout much of the developing world is simply going to be lost or has been lost already. And many people that had been lifted out of poverty into a kind of middle class status are not going to be there anymore. Let me just conclude by saying a little bit about the United States. So in my view, the election that we're going to have in less than 4 weeks now, on November 3rd, is the most important election in my lifetime. And I think it's important not just for Americans, but for the world as a whole. In my view, you know, I find it very hard to think of another president who, has done more to damage the rule of law in the U.S. than Trump has. He has no concept of what the rule of law means. The idea that there should be constraints on his actions is something completely foreign to him. And so, and because he's been so successful in bringing such a large part of the Republican Party with him, he's been invulnerable in the impeachment hearings, where he was clearly guilty of what he was charged with. And I think that, like many populist leaders, anytime he's met an institutional check or balance that has restricted his ability to do things like a court or the media or Congress or the bureaucracy, he's then attacked that institution and tried to undermine it. Now, he was, I think, in a pretty good position to win re-election in January, but because of this disastrous handling of the epidemic, I think he's going to lose. And it's really remarkable. Just in the past week, his poll numbers have been dropping. As you're well aware, we don't elect presidents by a popular vote in the United States. We have this electoral college, which gives undue influence to certain key swing states. But in every single swing state now, the polls are showing that he's losing by a pretty substantial number. And so you could face a situation after November where Biden becomes the president and the Republicans lose the Senate. And so you'll have unified Democratic control. I actually think this is very important. I think internationally, we have a number of organizations and alliances and structures that express solidarity, with other democratic countries. NATO is probably one of the most important. I think if Trump is reelected, I'm not sure that NATO will actually survive another Trump term, but I think we will recommit to that. I think, a number of other international bodies that support the liberal international order have all been weakened as a result of this presidency, but there'll be a recommitment to that, and so that is a good thing. There are many issues where I disagree with what the many Democrats would like to do on other aspects of policy, but I think internationally it will be a good thing. But we'll have to see because, virtually every day for the past, certainly the past month has brought a big surprise or revelation or, some new development that no one was expecting. And I'm afraid that may continue right up until the election itself. By the way, the ability of the United States to actually hold a clear, free and fair election, which I don't think anyone would have questioned, is really now under question because among the other things he's done, Trump has been every day questioning the legitimacy of our coming election and saying that it's going to be subject to massive fraud. There's no evidence that this will happen, but because he's going to lose, he's willing to do anything that he can to undermine a result that goes against him. And so there could be violence or, real disruptions to the actual electoral process. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but, that's the situation we're in. So with that, let me stop, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Frank. Lots of food for thought there. You've touched on really crucial issues, and let me try and expand on some of them and see if we can reach some conclusions. One of the first things that struck me as I listened to you was that many of the things you mentioned were a consequence of COVID-19 and the pandemic. In many ways were also trends that were perceptible before COVID-19. Would you agree with that? And would you say that the pandemic has, in many ways, accentuated and accelerated some of these trends rather than created trends that were not there in the first place?
Oh, absolutely. So we have been witnessing this rise of populism for several years now. The big events were really in 2016 with Trump's election and with the Brexit vote to leave the European Union. But since then, almost every European country has seen the rise of an anti-immigrant, illiberal, populist party. And there's been a big, focus on closing borders, on attacking foreigners, and I think COVID simply accelerated those trends. It gives actually every country a legitimate reason to close their borders, and that's something that politicians have jumped on. And it's also given a big advantage to certain democratically elected leaders who have authoritarian tendencies. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, one of the first things he did was he got his parliament, his party's majority in parliament to vote emergency powers. But this has happened in many other countries, in El Salvador or in Uganda or other places. It's a great excuse to expand executive authority, to override Congress, to remove different barriers to executive action. And that trend, was present before COVID, and it's simply been accelerated. So I think, yes, that's absolutely correct.
You mentioned, and of course I would agree with you, that it is not true, as some people think, that COVID-19 has shown that autocracies and dictatorships are better at handling these kinds of crises than democracies, because you cited, and you could have gone on and on, a number of democracies that have done fairly well. And also we could cite a lot of dictatorships that have totally mishandled this. At the same time, it is true that we've seen a strengthening, and this was also a trend before COVID-19, of authoritarianism under the leadership of very, very strong leaders. Despicable leaders in many ways, but strong leaders in their regions. People like Erdogan in Turkey, or people, of course, like Putin in Russia, Jinping and his nationalism in China, not to mention, of course, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So we have a number of very strong anti-democratic, illiberal leaders. The question, Frank, is, are these people an example to anyone around the world? Is there a danger that they could establish a paradigm that people, in many ways resentful of the kind of leadership we're seeing in Western liberal democracies, could suddenly begin to look at with admiration? Is there a risk there in the kind of potential contagion effect that these autocrats could have among other emerging countries?
Well, I think that's already begun to happen. So up until 2013, the Chinese leadership was always very careful to say that they didn't want to export their China model to other countries. I mean, there could be countries that admired it, but it really wasn't applicable to other places. But since the rise of Xi Jinping, that's changed, and they've been, touting their own model. The Belt and Road Initiative, which has really spread to virtually all regions of the world, I think has been their primary instrument. They're offering something that people really need. They need infrastructure. They need roads and electricity and ports and the like. And China is in a much better position to deliver that than many Western countries. And I think as a result, there are many people in the developing world that say the China model, has been very effective in delivering, substantive results to people. And so that's been, in a way, a major part of the competition and one of the sources of their influence. And the other thing that I think people are just waking up to is that China is using a lot of technology, new technologies to, promote their approach. For example, surveillance technology under their social credit system. They basically can keep track of every transaction that every one of their citizens makes, and that technology is being sold all over the developing world to poor countries that want to be able to monitor political opponents and the like. And so that, concrete aspect of Chinese authoritarianism is up for export. In Russia's case, it's a little bit different. I mean, they have actually been way in advance of China in being able to make use of the internet and of social media as a weapon. And there, the effort is a little bit different. They don't actually want to promote their own brand particularly. I think that relatively few people around the world say they want to emulate, Russia. I think people are mostly aware that it's a petro-state, and unless you're sitting on big energy reserves, most of the things that they do is not really available to other countries. What they try to do instead is to use social media to weaken the legitimacy of their democratic rivals. That's certainly what they've done in the United States, and so they'll imitate both. They'll contribute both to the kind of right-wing conspiracy theories of people supporting Trump, but they'll also imitate a Black Lives Matter activist and try to push the left to be more extreme. And what they really want to do is just promote polarization. They've supported separatist movements all over Europe. So anything they can do, to weaken the political consensus in democratic countries, they'll do. Plus which, we have to keep in mind that they also use conventional military powers. So they've invaded Georgia and they've invaded Ukraine, and they've essentially, used this kind of hybrid warfare against, many countries in their immediate periphery. Right now, I think people need to pay a lot of attention to Belarus. This is actually, we don't know this. I can't assert this with any confidence, but I think it's very likely that COVID may have had something to do with the weekly demonstrations that have now gone on, I think, for 8 or 9 straight weeks across Belarus, because Alexander Lukashenko has been, one of those leaders that denied the significance of the epidemic. He did very little to try to stop it, and as a result, they've had very bad results. And I think people could see this, and I think it may be one of the things that tipped the population into protesting. So I think it's important to see that, there's actually some positive consequences that could come out of this epidemic in terms of people reacting to bad leadership and trying to hold it accountable. We don't know what's going to happen in Belarus. I think, we've finally begun to ramp up sanctions a little bit against the leadership there, but I think we probably have not been paying, and this applies both to Europe, but especially to the United States. We've not been paying enough attention there and showing enough solidarity with, the population of Belarus. But I do think that it was one of those latent kinds of protests that was given expression by the government's response to the epidemic.
In an ideal world, if the United States decides not to lead liberal democracies in sustaining the liberal order, somebody else would step in. Other liberal democracies would step in, particularly, of course, European liberal democracies, and take on that huge responsibility. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Whenever the United States seems to move away from its responsibilities, what you have is a vacuum rather than somebody else stepping in. And that seems to be a huge problem. Who is leading the liberal order? Who is, would you say, who is right now the person or the leader or even the country that symbolizes those values that you and I hold dear and that many of the people listening to us hold dear, and that seem to be lacking the kind of leadership that's sorely needed right now?
Well, so the obvious answer to that would be the European Union, but I think the decision-making process and the structure of the European Union is really a big obstacle right now. So let's take this case of Belarus again. The EU finally agreed to a kind of limited set of sanctions against Belarus, but this comes 2 months after the start of this uprising against Lukashenko based on a stolen election. So why did it take the EU such a long time? Well, the answer is that in foreign policy, you need consensus among all of the member states of the EU, and there's one member state, Cyprus, that did not want to vote for sanctions because they wanted the EU to sanction Turkey, completely unrelated issue. So that may be a legitimate concern, but it shouldn't hold up the ability of the EU to act decisively on, I think what's really a moral and fundamental political issue, which is supporting, democratic movements in its neighborhood. And so the ability of, all member states to essentially veto action, collective action, is a crippling defect. Now, in certain other areas, like economic policy, you might argue the EU is a little bit too strong, and the EU Commission can take actions, that are not, strictly speaking, accountable democratically, but in foreign policy, it's a terrible decision-making system. And so I think that you really need greater, that structure needs to be rethought. Now, within the EU, obviously Germany has been the single country that has the potential of acting like an organizer. I don't think you'd want Germany by itself to be the leader, but certainly Germany, if it doesn't coordinate within the European Union, nothing is going to happen. And I would say there, things are not, they're not terrible. So I think that the agreement that happened over the summer for floating euro bonds, that was basically, hatched by Germany and France working together, was an extremely important development. I think that during the euro crisis in 2010, you saw this division open up between Northern and Southern Europe, which was really crippling because basically Germany and Denmark and other Northern European countries simply did not want to support Greece and Italy. And I think that was a big mistake. I mean, we can go over the history of that, but I think it was a big mistake. But I do think that Europe learned from that, and so I think the response to COVID has been a lot better. That there's been actually some movement towards a kind of Europe-wide solidarity, and I think that sort of thing really needs to increase, and that wouldn't have happened except for again Angela Merkel's leadership and being able to work with Macron to to get to that point. So that's the respect in which I think, Germany really does end up being kind of a central player in all of this because it's the only one that can lead these changes within the, within the framework of the EU to get that body to act collectively a little bit more effectively.
So populism in the United States, there was a time when the word populism in the United States stood for very admirable things, Jeffersonian type of populism, going back to the early days of the Republic, this anti-elitist sentiment that really expressed the idea that this was a nation founded not from the top down, but from the bottom up, where everybody had an opportunity to rise, very much opposite to what had gone on in Europe, where social structures were much more rigid. So that was the good kind of populism, if you wish. And then slowly populism has become in the United States something much more akin to what it has always meant for us in Latin America, for instance, or what it has meant since the 1930s, of course, in Western Europe. So why populism of this kind? Why did populism emerge in the United States in recent decades? What factors within the United States and within its democracy do you think gave rise to this sort of populism? And what do you think the consequences of this will be, in a few years down the road?
So I think that there's been this big debate about why populism arose in the United States in 2016, and it's centered around whether the factors are economic or cultural. The economic argument, I think, is pretty straightforward, that you had this 2-decade period of expanding globalization under kind of neoliberal policies that increased global wealth dramatically, but it also increased inequality within countries, including in the United States. And you had many working class Americans that lost jobs because they were being outsourced to Asia and to other parts of the developing world. And so this, was brought home to everybody by the crisis, the financial crisis in 2008, which widened that division. So I think that probably is a good explanation for the trigger. But I think the cultural factors are actually more important. The reason I think they're more important is that after 2008, one would have expected that you'd get left-wing populism because of that growing inequality. And instead, what you got was a populism of the right, which was not focused on building a welfare state that would protect people that had been left behind, but rather a populism that was directed against immigrants, against foreigners, against foreign competition, that wanted to move back to isolationism, withdraw from international organizations, and basically blamed outsiders. And this is true, across Europe as well. By the way, I would say that in Latin America, there's actually been two distinct kinds of populism. The most typical one is the left-wing populism that's represented by, Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales or Rafael Correa. Now, for the first time with Bolsonaro, you have the right-wing variety where, again, the emphasis is on, social conservatism, on race, on this kind of issue, rather than, building a strong redistributive state. But, most of Europe and the United States suffered from this right-wing populism. Now, in the United States, I think we have a very specific history that is related to our racial history. So obviously, the United States was one of the biggest slave-owning countries in the world. We had a big civil war over this issue that abolished slavery and, in theory, established juridical equality for African Americans. It took another 100 years for that promise actually to be realized. But by the 1960s, I think, you really had changed American national identity from one that had been based on race and gender as well, to one that really became much more open to everybody, living on the territory of the United States. And I think, that led to a very happy outcome in the second half of the 20th century, where liberal democracy and the market economy all worked, closely with one another and supported each other. But that's begun to change. And one of the big fractures that has emerged in the United States really is over race and whether American national identity ought to be based on a kind of liberal understanding of citizenship, based on democratic principles and, equal access for all people, or whether it should return to a kind of ethnic or racial understanding of what it meant to be an American. And, this is not by any means anything like a majority of the American people, but there is an important part of the Republican Party that believes, that really what it means to be an American is to be a white American, and what they regret is the loss of what they see as this, old understanding of America as basically a country descended from Europeans. And that's one of the reasons that they're desperately afraid of immigration, because they feel that the country's demographic balance is shifting against them and is going to be changed, in permanent ways. And, they're right in many respects. In my state of California, we are now a majority minority country where, white Americans are less than 50% of the total population. And so that's been in the background, I think, of a lot of the polarization. Now, you'd have to say that this is not the only issue driving people to vote for Donald Trump. I think there are a lot of more legitimate fears that especially working class Americans have of elites not listening to them, elites following policies that benefit themselves and not ordinary Americans. And I think it's important for all Democratic politicians to listen to those kinds of fears. But there is this other very sinister part of the right now that's represented by, certain important parts of the Republican Party that goes back to that, earlier American racial history. The core of the Republican Party really shifted beginning in the 1960s from being a northeastern establishment party to being an increasingly southern and western party. And now, the biggest voting base of the Republicans is the old Confederacy, the states of the South uh, that have gone from being completely Democratic to being completely Republican. And this is kind of the reality that underlies a lot of our present day polarization.
You've talked about, and not just here, but for a while, you've been talking about in the global distribution of power, about the shift to the east, of course. And the question I have is, where is that going to lead in the end? I mean, is it going to lead to the United States becoming, well, not exactly a second-rate global power, but perhaps a power that's no longer the most influential in the world in terms not only of hard power, but soft power? Is this going to mean that in economic terms, the United States will not be the strongest country, say 50 years from now? Is it going to mean that a new paradigm will emerge from the East, both in terms of economic and also political systems? I mean, where is this leading to exactly?
Well, I don't think that anything is determined at this point. I think the single biggest weakness right now of the United States is our high degree of polarization. And unless we can overcome this, I think it's going to continue to cripple us both in terms of hard power, but especially in terms of soft power. But, I don't think that it's inevitable that we remain as polarized as we are. I think, there is a path forward out of this. But it also depends, heavily on international cooperation. I think that democratic countries that share basic democratic values have to collaborate with one another. Donald Trump has kind of done the opposite. He likes Russia better than he likes, a struggling democracy like Ukraine, and feels much more comfortable dealing with authoritarian leaders and really doesn't like working with other, democratic leaders in, let's say, the G7. Um, and that's something that, hopefully is going to change. I think that if, for example, in containing Chinese influence, it's actually quite important that there be a lot of solidarity expressed among democratic countries that are threatened by Chinese power. So my personal opinion is that it's crazy for any democracy to allow Huawei, this Chinese electronics company, to build your critical telecom infrastructure. I think that there's really no such thing as an independent private sector in China. It's really ultimately all controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and to allow such an important aspect of your basic infrastructure to be built by a hostile power is wrong. And there should be agreement among democracies on how to deal with this. But we haven't had that because certainly from Washington, there hasn't been good leadership on this issue. So that's something that could be reversed. I think it's really urgent that we do that, whether we start talking among ourselves as democracies on ways to deal with both China and Russia and other emerging authoritarian threats. And if we do that, I don't think it's inevitable that their model is going to work because it has a lot of weaknesses as well. One weakness, is pretty evident. I mean, I think President Putin right now is desperately afraid that the same thing could happen in Russia that's happened in Belarus. That all of a sudden you get these massive demonstrations in multiple Russian cities that really don't stop. And that's something that, he drives a lot of his thinking. So, we shouldn't assume that these authoritarian models are going to win.
Yeah. No, very few people predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it happened. Very few people thought the PRE, which at the time looked like the most perfect system in the world in terms of autocracy, people thought would last forever, and it collapsed. So, of course, none of this is predetermined. But yeah, some of these trends are hugely important. We have some people in the audience who want to know, what would a Biden administration look like? What kinds of shifts in terms of internal domestic policy, but also foreign policy, would you expect from a Biden administration?
I don't envy Joe Biden if he becomes president because he's going to inherit a country that is suffering from deepening, health and economic crisis. And it's going to get worse, really, before it gets better. So his immediate focus is obviously going to be on dealing with those two issues. I think there'll be a large stimulus passed that we've not been able to pass in the last month or so. And I think there's going to be a big focus on health care. That's the single issue that he and the other Democrats are campaigning on. And it's one that's, just it's a no-brainer that our healthcare system has got lots of weaknesses, and we really need to expand Obamacare and so forth. I think in terms of foreign policy, since the president really does have the authority to act unilaterally, he's going to reinsert the United States into a host of international organizations. He will reaffirm support for NATO and for our Pacific alliances. He will go back into the Paris Climate Agreement. He'll rejoin the World Health Organization. I think those are steps that are pretty easy. But I think that what people have to be aware of is that he's also going to have a lot of constraints. It partly depends on what happens in the election. If the Republicans manage to hold on to the Senate, then he's going to be very constrained in what he can do, just like Obama was in the last 6 years of his presidency when the Republicans, held one of the houses of Congress. But even if the Democrats take complete control, there's going to be, some real problems. So one is that the populist core is not going to go away. They're going to try to undermine, virtually every initiative that Biden seeks to take. And if Biden is not seen as being quite successful early on in his presidency, then in 2022, the Republicans could come back in the midterm elections. But the other big problem is with the Democrats because, right now they're all unified in opposition to Trump, but there's now a big split between the centrist Democrats and, the left wing. That's people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and
They have their own populism there, of course.
yeah, they have their own populism, and that's both cultural and economic. And so, there's a lot of Democrats that, criticize Biden for not wanting Medicare for all. And then there are all of these identity groups within the Democratic Party that want, Biden to focus on, feminist or, racial or, gay and lesbian issues. And so this is all going to be something that will be very difficult for him to navigate because he really depends on the support of all of those groups, and he has to keep that coalition together. And whether he is able to do that, is anybody's guess.
Mm-hmm. Of course, much of the election result hinges on what happens in Florida. That's always the case, but in this particular election, it seems to be extremely important because a few weeks ago, Trump and Biden seem to be, at least from here, seem to be running neck and neck. Now Biden has an advantage, but it's not huge. And of course, the south of that state is extremely important in terms of the politics of the state as a whole. So both candidates are vying for the Hispanic vote, and particularly the Cuban and Venezuelan vote. We have many Latin Americans in the audience, and they're wondering, would there be a significant change in the foreign policy of the US towards Latin America should Biden become president?
Well, yeah, of course there's going to be a change. I mean, I think right now there isn't a Latin American policy. Trump's views on Latin America, I don't think he's got any, except that he doesn't like immigrants from Latin America. They've tried to focus, on the usual Republican targets, so they don't like Venezuela and Cuba, but they've been, quite ineffective in really figuring out how to support the opposition in Venezuela. And so I think, at least Biden will be able to locate Latin America on the map, and I suspect that he's going to have a, much more competent foreign policy staff that will, be able to deal with the region in a little bit more systematic way. It's actually quite one of the things that's a little bit troubling is that Biden's support among Hispanics is really not as strong as it ought to be, given how anti-immigrant and really kind of racist in many ways Trump has been about Hispanics. It's surprising that that support is as strong as it is, and I think that there may be those kind of social and cultural factors there, because I think a lot of Hispanics are actually socially quite conservative, and they distrust some of the the more left-wing trends within the Democratic Party that may be keeping them in the Republican fold. But beyond that, I think it's a little bit hard to predict very specific kinds of things. My hope is that there will be a much stronger regional effort led by people in the region to get Maduro out of power in Venezuela. I mean, the crisis there is just so unbelievably, tragic, and the fact that there hasn't been enough international pressure to support, the Democrats in that country is really, I think, a big policy failure. So hopefully, a new administration will allow a new approach to that.
Should there be a new administration, where do you see the tension between the US and China going? We have some questions from the audience as well about that. Do you see a détente between Beijing and Washington taking place at all? Is that total utopia?
I think that, China policy is one of the areas where there's actually a fair amount of consensus between the parties. What's happened over the last decade is that the American business community has really shifted its position on China. So they used to be the biggest advocates of engagement and good, cooperative relations with China. But many American companies have been really burned, and they're very angry. They've had their intellectual property stolen. They don't get access to the Chinese market the way Chinese companies have access to the American market. They're being increasingly squeezed out by the Communist Party, and a lot of them have left China as a result. And then the trade war and the COVID crisis, I think, have convinced a lot of multinational corporations that it just isn't safe to source so much of your supply chain from China. And so that's one of the big interest groups that has moved, and that's one of the reasons why the Democrats and the Republicans both are going to take a much more hostile view towards China. I think that one thing, however, that will be different is that hopefully Biden will be able to get more of a coalition together on China issues. You know, what Trump did was he attacked China, you know, I think in kind of stupid and needless ways, you know, like talking about the Chinese virus and, you know, trying to blame, you know, his failure in COVID on China and so forth, which was wrong and unnecessary. But he also then, you know, launched trade wars against all of his allies. And so he criticizes China, but then he goes after French wines and German cars and, you know, South Korean exports. And this is not the behavior of someone that actually wants to try to create an international coalition to oppose Chinese trade practices. So I think that, you know, if we return to a more normal kind of foreign policy, you know, so I guess one further thing to say is that part of the reason you're getting these terrible policies out of Washington is that many of our federal agencies, beginning with the State Department, don't have anybody competent staffing them. You know, one thing I'm struck by is how many spelling mistakes there are in decrees and announcements coming out of the White House. I mean, just stupid spelling mistakes and stupid factual mistakes. Like, you know, this Judge Barrett, this new Supreme Court justice went to Rhodes College, and the White House announcement said she was a Rhodes Scholar. And there's a big difference between the two, and they just didn't have somebody competent enough to do this basic fact checking. And so many of our federal agencies, beginning, as I said, with the State Department, simply do not have, you know, professionals with adequate amounts of knowledge to be actually able to run American foreign policy. And that is not something that's going to be reversed overnight. You know, that's a slower rebuilding process, but hopefully in a Biden administration, at least we will begin that process rather than continuing, you know, this undermining of professionals in the bureaucracy.
We have only a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you a last question about an issue that's particularly dear to me, which is immigration. My last book in English was about immigration, and I follow very closely the issue in the United States and elsewhere. Of course, immigration has been a fact of life for the United States since the beginning of the Republic. And while it is true to say that the US is a country built on immigrants, it's also true to say that there have been several periods throughout the history of the United States where there was a backlash against immigration, not just now, this has happened before. What I'm wondering is the following. I mean, if many of the things that you say are true, particularly about the effects, the long-lasting effects of the pandemic and the mishandling of the pandemic, well, the question is, will there be a new wave of migration in Western liberal democracies? And if so, will that create a backlash of the populist kind against immigration and therefore have further political consequences than there have already been?
I think that's entirely possible. Like I said, the crisis in developing countries has been a slow-moving one, but the economic conditions in many developing countries is steadily deteriorating, and it's going to continue to deteriorate over the coming months. And this is actually going to dovetail, I think, with the climate crisis, because you know, climate is changing very rapidly, and people have been predicting for many years that, you know, that crisis is also going to generate a lot of migration. So I think between these two, yes, the answer is, in time, we will see big pressure on people that want to move from places that are really, you know, uninhabitable to places that offer them and their families, you know, better opportunities. And that's going to be a continuing source of backlash and populism, I think, in the receiving countries.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Frank. This has been a really inspiring discussion, one that I hope we will be able to continue at some point in the future. You're a very busy man, so we're really honored that you have put some time aside for us and enlightened us in this past hour with many of your comments. Thanks so much for joining us today from California.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, see you soon.
Bye-bye.